I know that John Paul or Taryn will be kind enough to let them in. I also vote for more children on meetings. Children and pets, they make the meetings much more joyful in all the ways. So bring them on. It has been a while since we have seen each other's faces. And last time we got together, we were talking about a first cut at the draft standards. You gave great comments. We sent that back to our writers. We have at least a couple of our writers on today's meeting, so we can also get some insights from some of you. Where we are today is that we have a change in the timeline. And so I'm going to spend a little time with you talking through why that timeline has changed and what that means. What I'm still hoping the SISAC will do as part of this revised timeline. And then I'd love to leave much of the time of our discussion for really getting your insights into what it will look like to roll out and implement the new standards and how long you realistically think we should forecast for that. So when we have talked about this, I, in my head, never imagined that we would simply drop the new standards and say, ta-da, everything has changed. But we never explicitly talked about what it would look like. How much time do we expect it to take? How many years do we think is reasonable to say you're making a gradual shift from the old standards to the new? And what might we expect to be occurring in each year before we get to full implementation? I think this is especially important because in the new draft standards, we have seen some real course shifts. There have been some courses that have gone fully from what we know them as now to something very different. And Scott, I know you will find this particularly important. One person who attended our state board engagement session this weekend at the MLK Library is a DCPS educator, and she volunteered that there's some curriculum alignment between ELA curriculum and social studies curriculum in DCPS that is really difficult to disconnect, and that she would hope and expect that there'd be a need to be revisions to both ELA and social studies. And so again, we can't just snap our fingers or wave our favorite magic wands and expect that to happen immediately. So want to leave plenty of time for that. But let's go ahead and start with the changes to the timeline. I'm going to actually share my screen for a second just to show the timeline that I put in the agenda in a way that everyone can, I hope, see it together and talk through why. And I'm going to be candid, but I'm also going to leave time for questions in case folks want to dig in more on this situation. Can you all see the agenda here and the little box timeline? Great. So our initial plan had been that in December 2021, we would release the new draft public standards for public comment. We would leave those standards open for at least 30 days. OSSE would get that feedback and would come back to the board with a set of revised standards for us to vote to adopt sometime in the spring. We had bandied back and forth, whether that would be March or April, maybe as early as May, maybe as late as May, but that was the window we were looking at. Here we are today in December, and we don't have a comprehensive set of draft standards that we feel are ready for prime time. I have had a chance to look at all the draft standards since OSSE incorporated some revisions that were suggested by members of the SISAC and other members of the public earlier this fall. The 6 to 12 standards are so exciting. There's so much in them that is super great and I think is going to be really substantive for the public to engage on. The elementary school standards are so different than what they were before. And in conversations, both with folks at OSSE and with other folks in the elementary school space, there's still, I think, some work that needs to be done. And I think OSSE feels similarly around making sure that in the shift in thinking about the standards in such a different way than they've been presented before, that we don't lose opportunities for scaffolded building of knowledge and skills over time. And right now, the way the standards are drafted, it's not exactly obvious to those who did not write them how that work happens. So we want to get those standards to that place where when we put them out to the public's first set of responses isn't, I don't get it, but is instead substantive, responding to the content, making sure they can ask good questions and give good feedback. So because of that, we know two things are true. OSSE does not have any staff full-time dedicated to the social studies. So they can't just say to someone, take this on, make this your body of work to get it ready ASAP. They are in the process of finalizing a contract with support. They'd had someone supporting the writing committee up through the end of the fiscal year. Then the fiscal year ended. Contracting and procurement has to do its thing. So that new contract is just about to come online. They need time to ramp up with that contractor, and they need time to get back with the elementary writers, with folks at OSSE, and to make those needed changes to the elementary school standards. So we're pushing back the timeline by a couple of months to leave time and space for that to happen. The other thing that's happening in that time is, of course, the holidays. So we also have like 2 weeks when we're not expecting a ton of work to take place. So we're pushing back this public engagement on the standards out until March of 2022. What does that do to everything else? Couple things. One, it allows time for OSSE, the writers, the new contractor, the state board to keep working on the revised elementary school standards. 2, it allows for preparation for public engagement, both procedurally, like what do we want the survey form to actually look like to send out to the public? How do we want to tee up all the folks we want to make sure have access and get to weigh in? How many languages do we need to translate this into to make this publicly accessible for the maximum members of the public to weigh in on the standards? Next, it also talks about an opportunity for us to, if you look in the March 2022 section, to really think about this timeline for implementation, so that when we put the standards out for public review, we can also talk about what we expect the rollout to look like, so that we're not hiding the ball on that, but that when LEA leaders put their public comment in, when teachers see these standards and say, like, you're going to expect me to teach this whole new thing next year, that we're clearer with them on exactly what the rollout's going to look like. The other thing it does do, though, is that it pushes back the state board vote on the standards. Reasonably, if we're not putting them out for public comment in March, they need to stay open through April. We need time to take those revisions and draft the final standards, make any changes, prepare them in a pretty way for vote and presentation, and then we need to vote on them. So realistically, this vote on the standards for the state board is now happening in July rather than in March or April or May. That does leave then a whole bunch of time to engage with the public about rolling out the new standards, both the summer preceding the 2022-2023 year, as well as the first part of that 2022-2023 year. The reason this timeline ends at December 22 is a purely practical one. This board's term for a number of us ends in December of 2022. So I don't want to forecast a time that I am not on the board for the work of this committee and this board. But through December 22, this work is envisioned in this way. I'm going to stop sharing for a second and see if you have questions about this timeline or want to talk at all more about what's there, what the change is, and why it's happened. And also, folks who are on the writing committee, if you have any questions or thoughts and want to weigh in, I welcome that as well.
Hi, Jessica, Guy on writing committee.
Hi, Mike.
I'll let others ask a lot of questions as well, but I think just one that I heard you say I wanted to latch on to. Did I hear you refer to new support in terms of what the contracting would be? Would this be a different support than AIR? So
I am not for certain on who the contractor is. However, I can say that today I was told it is likely that there is a new contractor coming on board. Some of that, you know, I think many of us who work in and around DC government could write a book on the complexities of contracting and procurement. But it is my understanding that the contract has been awarded to a different contractor. If that's the case, and I would imagine others who are still on the writing committee have a whole bunch of follow-up questions. Maybe if we could talk offline as to like how to proceed. For sure. I appreciate that question, and we'll put it in my parking lot here for a second, mostly because I think I probably need to get some more answers before that we can do that. But I definitely want to collect all those questions so I can help get them answered.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
I have a question as well.
Yeah.
So I know that there's been conversation with the writing team about bringing in some or getting some advice from folks who are not necessarily on the writing committee, but may have specific expertise that may be helpful to the writing committee. So like if they're trying to figure out the wording of standards around Hinduism, for example, talking to the Hindu American Foundation or, things like that. I don't know if you know the answer to this question, so maybe this is for OSSE, if not. But do you I don't know if some of those conversations have happened since the first draft came out until now, or if potentially this delay that we're pushing back might allow for those kinds of conversations to happen with some of those experts before we move to the public outreach that's scheduled for March now. So just wondering if you could speak to that.
That's a great question, Scott. So to Mike's comment, there's been question about it. To my understanding, there has not been time for that. And in answer to your question, I do think that this delay provides opportunity for that. I also think that some of those expert groups that have already been very eager to ask about when the standards will be available for their review would be very happy to be consulted. So I think that is a question for OSSE and the writing team, but I do think that's a neat opportunity that we give ourselves by pushing this timeline back. And I will say, I am trying to see this whole thing as an opportunity to get to the goal that we all care about, which is we all want strong revised standards that we think are going to be good for our kids, that we think are going to make the improvements that you all outlined in the guiding principles, and we want to get it right. So I'm fine if it takes more time if we get it right.
I second that, Jessica. As a member of the technical writing committee, I'm actually grateful to have this time. It felt rushed. And it felt like we were proceeding at a breakneck pace, which contradicts any kind of mindful approach to this, which I'm hoping that we can achieve. So I'm thrilled that this has been pushed back. I think we'll have stronger standards as a result.
That makes me happy to hear, and also makes me like my shoulders just came down another quarter inch. Okay, the writers think this is a good idea too. Excellent.
Yeah. I mean, especially speaking from, having worked on the elementary team, right? And being in charge of delivering so much content in the same amount of time as middle school and high school, it's just, we were just grappling with a ton of content. So yeah, we needed time.
Yeah. And I'll say, and then I'm going to come to Jessica. I think too, one of the pieces of feedback the writing committee gave to me as we were sharing the SysX feedback with the writing committee was the time to vertically align, to build that through line between middle and high and elementary and middle, and then elementary, middle, and high was something that was hard to do on that timeline. So providing this opportunity for more time seems like another opportunity for that as well. Jessica, coming to you.
Yeah, thank you. First, apologies for my tardiness and then having to depart early. I want to just say thank you for having extended time. I think that can often really help yield more thoughtful thoughts, for lack of a better term. And I imagine that these standards will live for some time. So I'm grateful that we're taking our time. And then my wondering, particularly based on this time of year and having conversations with teachers, is around the framing for how we get feedback and then from the public and how we implement it in terms of like the rollout. And so with COVID, I think there's been this hypervigilance on making up for like lost learning or interrupted learning. And so I think being sensitive to teachers in terms of how we frame having these newly available, revised, culturally relevant standards will be essential to getting folks invested, because this could also sound like another thing after this year. You want me to learn all of this new stuff, and then just being mindful of that, so we get the full range of all the great thought and effort that went into revising the standards.
Yeah, I so appreciate you giving voice to that, Jessica. And the way you put it, I think, is particularly powerful. Something I shared with my colleagues on the board today when we were finalizing this extension in the timeline was that point not put nearly as eloquently around the fact that we want these standards to be welcomed. We want them to be things that our educators get excited about. Given all that we have asked of you all over the past 2 years, if we roll them out and say, here they are, get to work, it will be a burden rather than a welcome. So as we think about the rollout, and I'm fine if we shift into a conversation that merges both of these together, I'd love to hear, like, what is on your mind as you think about that, as you think about providing a process for rolling out these standards that helps them be seen as a welcome change rather than a burden. So feel free to meld these two together. Any other questions on the timeline as we move towards that melded conversation around thinking about the rollout?
What's interesting to me is, something I just jumped to right away is natural times to roll out would be like beginning of middle school, beginning of high school, beginning of like pre-K or K, whenever we decide. And yet there's an alignment piece that needs to be considered as well. So in a way, we would kind of need to backtrack and still make sure that a lot of critical content that's required for graduation is still being hit. And so then that kind of forces us to go back, depending on what we decide for the rollout, is going to be another lens that I think we would want to bring back to the standards. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so say more about that, because I think that's, so, as I think about the rollout, I guess I'm thinking about two things. I'm thinking about the standards are going to be out there and people are going to need to familiarize themselves with it. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, two, we need folks to feel like they can understand the kinds of materials and curriculum that are needed to actually implement these new standards. And that may be folks at the curriculum level as well as folks at the classroom level. And then third, there's also the actual shift of when do we parse out, like, this grade should be on these new standards by this year, and then the following fall into sequence in order to make it all work, right? If we're expecting that something that is going to be taught in 7th grade requires 6th grade prerequisites, but we're shifting that knowledge content, we got to shift the 6th grade first before we go to so there's sort of three things that are on my mind about the rollout, which is like, one, how long do we want the whole thing to take? Two, what's the timeline for socializing and preparing? And then three, what's the timeline for actually implementing, and what's the right sequencing?
Right. I guess the thing I was originally thinking about is like seizing upon transition points that are already built into children's education. And it tends to be kind of between those, transitioning between the physical plants of school buildings, right? Mm-hmm. So that's, can we capitalize on that transition naturally? That's still a pretty big swath for elementary. So is there an opportunity to make that transition point when they go into upper elementary, from lower elementary to upper elementary, so that, kids are getting this content in K? And I have a feeling Scott Abbott is tearing his hair out right now as I talk about this. So weigh in, Scott, right after this. But then we would go into, so then first would get it, they would transition into second, so that second year. I'm sorry, I backtracked. Scott, fix everything I just said.
Well, I think you're bringing up a good issue, Sarah, which is like, when we're thinking about the rollout, are we thinking that it's sort of like, here's the, pre-K 12 standards, and like, we're going to start on a certain date and these will be the standards at that date going forward? Or I think what Sarah's describing a little bit, if I have you right, Sarah, is like, should we start and roll out like, the next year, start with these new kindergarten standards. And so this cohort of students now is moving up through the system, having experienced these new standards. Is that like the distinction you're saying is like?
Yeah, thank you for finishing my sentences. Right. And so they would receive, so the K teachers would be trained up and supported for K, and then that would transition to 4th. And so we would have a cohort who's receiving. That would mean we'd have a couple cohorts who are receiving teachers, always having teachers breaking in the curriculum with them, which is not ideal, but that is what I was wondering as an option.
It would also take 8 years then to bring the curriculum across an elementary school. And so that's 8 years of students still on the old, or 7 years, I guess, of students still on the old standards and old curriculum and old curricular tools moving through an elementary school. If we think about that preschool to 5th grade.
Understood, which is why I wondered if there could be a break between upper elementary and lower elementary, so that like bringing it into K and third or something like that. But I'm going to stop talking and let everyone else weigh in.
I also wonder how much of this lives at an LEA level, right? Like I could think like at my school, I'd imagine would look possibly very different with an expeditionary learning model than a school that needs to then research and purchase a new curriculum. And asking about cake.
Cake is an important question. Other thoughts on implementation rollout? They don't have to be linear. Darren is going to do an excellent job capturing notes. Daniel?
Is it possible to bring in some outside experts? There's been a lot of work in the last 2 years on Common Core implementation, where people identified a lot of missteps there that really undermine the effectiveness of the Common Core. And I'm wondering if maybe we could hear from some people that have done work in that area so that we might avoid some of those missteps going forward with these.
It's for kind of for work.
Yeah, that's really a helpful suggestion, Daniel. I actually I just read some of that. I know Morgan Polikoff has been doing some work on the implementation of curriculum and would be curious how that may translate into this.
And I have a question. So I'm not on the writing team, so maybe this is more towards the people on the technical writing committee, but I know in the past, it seems like there were like the guiding principles or like the core themes. Like, are there ways that you could break out, like, these are the most important things that we need to start transitioning over to? So that like, and I'm not saying it's like everything, and this could be a dumb question, so feel free to tell me it's a dumb question, but are there like little things that like for those, if you were to do like a cohort model where like kindergarten, 4th, 6th, whatever it is, are there things that the other groups could be like trying so that it's not like brand
take the kids to the library? Or just take them to the rec center?
Here.
How many fit to the rec center?
And also, I apologize for the dachshund that keeps attacking me. It's not my dog.
Attack dachshunds are also welcome in our meetings. Maybe not at your ankles, but in our meeting.
Jen, your comment makes me think when Common Core came out, they some folks developed like here are the main shifts of the Common Core. And similarly, when the C3 framework came out, there was a group of folks that worked on what are kind of like the main shifts of the C3 framework. So that makes me think like in terms of implementation rollout, could we, get together the SISAC and the writing committee and maybe try to craft some of those kinds of things of like, well, here was the principles, here's the standards, but like, here's kind of like the main shifts that we need to be thinking about. Perhaps it's even different depending on the grade band. Like that message might be a little bit different. I think from the C3 perspective, but I think about like when we started rolling that out in DCPS, that helped some of our teachers, I think, to make sense of like this whole big, massive document, like boil it down to some things. And now let's look and see how those play out in particular grade levels.
Yeah, I would just add that I think related to that, we can almost kind of view the 3 levels in an order of least to largest changes for teachers and LEAs to anticipate. Least being high school, and as has been brought up earlier at this point, elementary probably being the greatest, with middle also being pretty heavy. I think to provide some examples to that, I think the reason why high school would certainly be the least is because, just given the basic graduation requirements, the structure of the courses did not change. The content certainly has, I think, in a lot of ways, really significantly and importantly, to better reflect the guiding principles. But at the end of the day, the course content, big picture wise, is the same. Some middle school courses have changed pretty significantly, and definitely some elementary school ones. So I do wonder if kind of thinking around more accessible courses for point of entry or shift is a way to open up that process.
I think too, Scott, to that question, one of the things that, again, comes to mind from the teacher who shared this on Saturday at our engagement session is the question around what other curricula may be affected by shifts in the social studies, or maybe we may suggest review concurrently as you prepare curriculum to implement the new standards, including ELA or writing curriculum, given the effort that the new standards make to align with Common Core ELA standards.
Jessica, one thing also I would say too, that I know that we've very loosely talked about on the writing committee, is it has been a pretty nice mix of LEAs representing, and we've tried as much as we can to bring in the voice and the considerations of those really small LEAs that have very minimal resources. So as we do talk about implementation or trainings and all of that, I think that we just want to be very mindful of ensuring that we're including as many of those LEAs and most importantly teachers as possible.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Mike. So let me push a little bit on that, because I think that becomes important as we think about this implementation and rollout and how we want to talk about this to the public as part of this work. You know, I've made no secret of the fact that I think it's really important that we continue to have multiple LEAs and many LEAs in the city involved in this. And also that because we have now built this cadre of folks in the social studies who've come together for two purposes, to advise the state board, to write for OSSE, we have this network of experts who have their own networks of other folks they work with. It would be great, in my estimation, to say, how do we keep harnessing this network as part of the rollout? Not because I want to give you all more jobs forever, but because I think there's a question that suggests, is there an opportunity to say, as part of the rollout, we need a budget, and that budget needs to include money for professional development and for voluntary state curriculum unit writing, say, that would be offered open source at the state level, but co-written by teachers across multiple LEAs. And my goodness, if there was a voluntary state curricular unit on X aligned with the new standards, written by a teacher from Two Rivers and a teacher from a DCPS elementary school and a teacher from, Center City, why wouldn't more LEAs adopt that? Because it would be a cross section of our educational community who are all experts in the standards. Is that crazy talk, or like, would this be worth us pursuing and pushing on?
Well, this kind of aligns to like part of what I'm thinking a lot about right now is like the budget to support this shift. And I think that's a question that I have, is really like, yeah, what is there going to be state level funding available to do that kind of work, as you're kind of describing? If there's not, I know we have to do something. Like we're going to have to, figure out a change for that. The timeline shift is also making me think about, as it relates to budget, might we have an opportunity, whether at the state level or at the LEA level, when we have a fair amount of federal money on the table for a short period of time, that might actually coincide right with the time that we need to do a lot of curriculum work, like ESSER money, for example. And like, are there things that we can do to take advantage of that funding that may not be available for us in another year or two? The other part that I think about, different LEAs may want to go different routes. I know that when we do curriculum work in DCPS, some of it can be contract stuff, but a lot of it is really done in partnership with our teachers, like, for example, Sarah. And so like one thing I'm looking at with this timeline is there a way that we can take advantage of this summer to be able to, like, I know teachers are really tired and burnt out and overwhelmed, so I don't want to put more on them. And also we really want to make sure that their input is heard in whatever curriculum work we're doing. So I'm wondering if this timeline will allow us to still do some things with teachers this summer and also next summer, so I guess summer of 2022 as well as summer of 2023, because just knowing it's tough for teachers to really have enough time during the school year to engage in a kind of curriculum work and have enough time to do it at the level we'd want them to do it. And Daniel also on the curriculum side too. Yeah, sorry, I'm seeing multiple faces of people who've helped with curriculum work in DCPS. So that's the budget is part of it, and the time with teachers I think is also really important to me as I'm thinking about this too.
So
Yeah,
Scott, go ahead.
I was going to say everything that Scott said. Yes, funding, time for teachers to think about it. I love the idea of teachers getting to co-create units. I was thinking, even if it wasn't something an LEA chose to use, having a model is really helpful. Like, I could think that maybe my LEA would not choose to use these units, but like they could become a model for how we build out an expedition. They could become a model for, we're looking to purchase a curriculum. Let's look at what DC has written. I just think a lot of options. I think funding is a big piece of it.
Yeah.
I think, oh, sorry.
Daniel, go.
I was saying if we could create maybe like alignment guides, that would be really helpful. So not necessarily curricula, but clear guidance on what an aligned curriculum would look like. And then another point is with regard to implementation is evaluation. So are we planning ways to evaluate how effectively implementation efforts are? I don't know what the outcome or outcomes necessarily would be, but I think that's an important thing to consider kind of on the front end, kind of what our goal is in terms of implementation, and try to make sure that we're measuring that as we go along.
Daniel, let's talk more about that for a second, because this is another question that has come up at these SBOE and the city engagement events, which is twofold. One, how are we evaluating whether the standards are being implemented with fidelity, right? So how are we checking students' knowledge, skills, and attainment? And then two, I think is the question around like, how are we assessing how well we have done with the rollout? How well are teachers supported? How well are LEAs feeling like they've got curriculum that aligns with the standards? So both an assessment of the state's doing its work to support its schools, and then the schools doing its work to implement the standards. So I'd love to hear more thoughts on that. Like, are there ideas you've got on either or?
I mean, I think it would be wonderful if we could come to some agreement about student evaluations around this. It's kind of a thorny issue, I think, but I think it would be great if we could. You know, we're going through this effort, and there are certain things that it seems like we really want students to gain from these new standards. So I think it'd be wonderful if we measured that. And then to your second point about kind of how we measure the process, I think that's really important too, whether it's something as informal as like surveys going along, or something a little bit more in depth in some way. I think that would be really important, kind of formatively, to make sure that we're on track, particularly if it's a multi-year implementation rollout process.
Other thoughts on this evaluating student learning, assessing student learning? Scott's asking the good question there. And I mean, this is sort of $1 million question, right? That we don't have a statewide social studies assessment. There's a lot of concern about adding additional assessments to students' plates. There's also the reality that we want to make sure students are able to do the things we've outlined for them in the standards. So I mean, you guys are my experts on this. You're the ones who spend a lot of time thinking about this. What are your thoughts?
So yeah, I think in terms of assessing student learning on the new standards, I think there's a way that we could do this with some sort of mixed methods approach that would allow for independence within classrooms, right? So we could think about like, we might not need to mandate some sort of standardized state level or DC, well, I'm jumping ahead of myself, city level, tests. We could have like different types of assessments that are available for different teachers to choose to use for as sort of like pre and post tests. We could also like give teachers the chance to create their own assessments. Baltimore City has done this for a while. I used to teach social studies there. I also, DC State. I'm also really gung-ho on making sure that we get student input on this in terms of just qualitative data. And we could do this via focus groups or surveys. I actually wanted to ask this question earlier and walk us a little bit back from implementation and rollout. Remind me if I've missed something, folks from the writing committee, but I am a little concerned about the extent to which student voice has been a part of this process. I think if we're trying to do this for them and we're trying to say that like, oh, these standards are going to be representative of their needs, we can't do that without them being a bigger part of this process. I think, and please let me know if this has happened a lot and I'm just not seeing it. But I guess my question is, one, is there time to make sure that students get to see these standards and give some feedback before we actually roll them out? Two, what can we do to make sure that we get a diverse cross section of students giving us feedback? And when I say diverse, I don't just mean demographically, I mean like across like how students show up in schools. I think we tend to, lean on like the sort of advisory council-esque students for things like this, but those students are outliers, to be frank. And it's important to get representations of what most students are like and what they think about these social studies standards. So I'm really curious to know what we're doing to make sure that their voices are heard. Like, are we getting focus groups together for classrooms across different LEAs? And because it will take intention, because sending surveys out will not lead to a bunch of student data. It just won't. So I'm just curious about like what's being done, or if things have already been done that I've missed, to make sure that that's happening.
I mean,
To answer that question, that hasn't happened at the elementary level. Mike, sorry to cut you off, but that does bring up a concern I've had, wondering about, is there ever an opportunity to test any of this like elementary content with a group of students, or just to float it by them, or just to see how it lands? So speaking to that student piece, I think it should be a critical part of this conversation. So.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I think that their voice has been represented as much, or to the extent that it was represented in the crafting of the guiding principles.
Okay, I would argue we should have.
Yeah, I would agree with that as well. So yeah, I think that, yeah, I mean, the reality is, I 100% agree with what you said of like surveys, they are what they are, right? And I think that was our means of pulling in student voice there. And I think that at this point in time, the current plan is only to pull in student voice through public comment, which, yeah.
Fidel, let me ask.
I'm inclined with your thoughts.
Yeah, Fidel, let me ask this. Like, thinking about student voice in the process from year on out, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we have the chance to test the draft standards with students.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a couple ways, to your point about like focus groups, that we could do that, right? Once the standards are out for public comment, the board could certainly talk about, like, could members go run focus groups at middle and high schools in our respective wards during that public comment period, to basically take the standards, sit with a group of students, ask them, what they think of them, what they like, what they don't like, what they wonder about, what's missing. So I think that's certainly something that could be done. But I'm wondering if you're thinking more, like, is there another way that you're thinking about how we might approach it besides engaging them in public comment in some way beyond like a digital online survey?
I think largely it was just like getting them in a room and getting them to talk, which I don't think we've been doing. I think just like I said, when you default to digital surveys, like, you're just not going to get student voice. And it is not a huge lift to tell a principal, like, can you get me 10 kids of mixed ability, to like to talk to me about social studies for 30 minutes, right? Yeah. And you could do this going school to school. I think my concern about this might more so be like process wise, like we just said, I do wish like this would have happened like earlier in the process, because it would have been good to go into the guiding principles and the writing, knowing what students were saying about like, well, I never learned this in social studies, or we always learn this, we learned this 5 years in a row, and like I would rather not have to repeat this every year. I think those things, I think that will just be important. Just thinking about other initiatives that SBOE and OSSE might take over moving forward, but I do think we could do this in the public comment with focus groups at schools fairly easily.
Okay. I like that idea a lot, Fidel, and I appreciate you bringing it up. I will also say, like, and I think I've shared this with you all a couple of times, but the effort we've put together on a board around putting together the social studies standards revision is also meant to become a model for like, what will it look like for the state to do other standards? What will the process look like? And so that's a really helpful piece of feedback on that front, which is like more student voice at more points in the process, beginning, middle, and end, not just in the public comment period. I'll also just share that when I was a minute late to our focus group, to our conversation tonight, I said I was coming from a focus group with parents. But next week, I get to go have a focus group with students at this school, which is a Montessori school. And fascinating, because I was like, I'd love to speak with the older kids. And one of the school leaders was like, oh, no, you should speak with the younger kids too. And I'm super excited because I'm going to get to have a focus group all across the grade levels at this Montessori setting to ask them what they like about their school, what they want to be different about their school, what they dream for other students at their school. And I am fascinated to see what happens. So I'm super excited with your suggestion, Fadal, and it like dovetails nicely with other things that have been on my brain. Other thoughts about implementation or feedback or other elements of the timeline? We've got about 15 minutes left, and there's some folks we haven't heard from yet.
Okay, I'll follow up.
You'll bite.
I agree on the student voice, but I would also, and I'm focused on the sort of process of getting these standards approved and getting public input. The more we can go beyond those surveys, I think they may be valuable to the board, but to me, there's very little substantive information, and it's so discriminatory and so inequitable in terms of how people are filling them out. And I think the more we can have discussion-based input among different constituencies, and I guess I have a question for the writers, which is, how do you see getting feedback on the standards? If the standards are really as different, I'm really interested in what the elementary standards are going to look like. But if these are really different, people are going to want to talk about them, and we need to have discussion. It can't be just people, hitting numbers in a survey. So I think, parents and community members and experts, there are a lot of people that care about standards and could be helpful in sort of getting to the right place. So, I'm interested, number one, in sort of getting especially the writers, sort of how you see that, if there's an opportunity even for grade level discussions where you can just look at what second grade looks like and get people around that. Second point, I'll say that I still haven't gotten over the fact that you're changing contractors in the middle of this process. So I think that's very unsettling, or it would be if I were a writer. And I just feel that if OSSE is going to be managing from the state level new social studies standards and whatever support, there needs to be a social studies person at OSSE. And if we need to advocate for that from the outside as well as the inside, then we really need to do that. It just seems crazy to be doing this with nobody that is in the system that will be there long-term to push this through. So I for one would, try to mobilize people however it works. I just think there needs to be social studies expertise within OSSE. Those are just two comments I have.
Thank you for that, Sally. So I appreciate the comment on a social studies person at OSSE. I share that vision. And to Scott's earlier point, I think there is a need for budget advocacy on this issue. We've got a new set of state standards that are going to roll out. We need money. We've got a new state set of standards in a topic area that the state education agency does not currently have staff for. We need money to make that happen. So I think there's a real opportunity for budget advocacy there. I also think the point about feedback and getting away from surveys is one I'd love to spend another minute or two on. So what do you think about, we've pushed back the timeline. We're going to roll out the standards for public engagement in March. It's not the holiday period, so maybe it's easier, but it is standardized testing time, so maybe it's not easier. What do you think about opportunities to engage the public that go beyond the survey? Does it make sense to you to have, in addition to focus groups of students, should we have focus groups with teachers? Should we have other sorts of focus groups, and who should run those? I'm cognizant of my love of this work, but also the fact that I have a full-time job in addition to this one. So thinking about realistically, is this something you'd want board members to do? Is this something you'd want writing committee members to do? Is this something you'd want CISAC members to do? Or is this something you'd want, us to seek funding for, which is a tougher ask in the middle of a fiscal year, but perhaps not impossible.
Jessica, with only 9 minutes left, I'm going to be really brief because I want to allow others to speak. But just to add to this also, I think one consideration we have discussed on the writing committee is additionally measures and steps to take for the reality that it's very likely that this process is going to attempt to be bombarded and hijacked by out-of-state actors acting in bad faith.
Yep.
So what should be the preventative steps taken on that as well? I think also needs to factor in our thinking.
Thanks for that, Mike. Laura?
Yeah, sorry I'm late. I guess, on the engaging teacher side, probably, this won't help with the charter sector, but at least on the DCPS side, like Washington Teachers Union, probably, combined with the social studies department could probably arrange like a time. So if there was something that was like already prepared, or if it was more just, even if it's a rough outline of like, just here's the kinds of things we want feedback on. Like I know like Scott Abbott's run some of those, and even some of the other teachers have like had informal ones where we got to like sit and talk, but that we could probably put something together, and I could commit to helping facilitate that as well if or we do it through the PD day. That makes sense.
Thanks for that, Laura, and thanks for the dates on that, Scott. I'll make sure those get into our notes so that we can perhaps push to have things available for that timeline.
I think in terms of getting teacher feedback, it's always important to remember, if we're doing anything with teachers, that they currently have a job that's impractical. So we never add anything to their plates. We just need to change the shape of it. So I think that means like, similar to with students, doing these like sort of feedback sessions during school hours, like when they're already being paid. And but I think that also means that like, it's, as a lot of people have said, we're gonna need somebody at OSSE who's working, who for whom this is their job, because there's going to need to be somebody who's doing the 9 to 5 stuff. And in response to what Mike was saying about like some of those out-of-state actors, I think like that gives us even more incentive to make sure that we're getting the word of our DC community, right? Like if we can point to, well, here's what everyone in DC is saying versus what all of these outside actors are saying. Like I think that gives us an easier like sort of vantage point to be able to push that these are clearly bad actors, and like we're trying to serve what our community wants and needs.
Building on that, and I'm sorry, I know that I've hogged up a lot of airtime already, but I do want to add that building on that argument that Fadal and Mike have made, I think it's really important to have a touch point who actually knows DC really well. So hiring outside contractors, I think we run the risk of them not being aware of kind of how uniquely positioned DC is as not yet a state, but going to be a state. And some of the nuances that brings to bear.
Well noted, Sarah. Before I move to wrap us up, any thoughts from folks who were able to join us a little bit later, haven't gotten to weigh in yet?
Hi, this is Emily. I apologize for joining late, and I've been off camera because my 3-year-old is here with me. But I just was having a conversation in the chat with Sarah because she and I had worked on the elementary standards. I think I missed the whole changing contractors, elementary stuff. Can you just quickly recap? I apologize.
Absolutely. No, happy to do so. So the elementary school standards are still in draft form and need more work before they're going to be released. And rather than releasing the standards piecemeal, 6-12 now while they're ready and elementary later, we are moving back the timeline so that the full set of draft standards will be released concurrently in March.
Got it. And so are the standards being revised by someone out, like a group outside of the technical writing committee, or going back?
No, they're being revised by the technical writing committee, but that group had been supported by a contractor OSSE had last fiscal year. In the new contracting process, the contract was awarded to a different contractor.
Got it. Okay. No, I was just asking because Sarah and I were on the elementary writing team. So
no, it's still you guys.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Yeah.
I guess, is this going to be like, kind of what's the next step? It seems like a lot of people want focus groups, and I agree. I think that's a good idea, but I think to make it worthwhile, are we just doing like convenient samples? Are we going to try to systematically sample specific groups across DC? What groups are we trying to sample? who's conducting these, how are we analyzing the data, what are the feedback loops? There just seem to be like a lot of things that would really need to be mapped out. And do we have like next steps for when we would talk about that?
Yep. So Daniel, I appreciate one, you bringing that research analytic mind to the good question asking and giving me a nice segue to the next steps. So what comes next? One, the board is going to hear as a whole about the pushing back of the timeline at our public meeting next week. Our leadership is aware, the Education Standards Committee is aware, but the board as a whole is going to sort of have that note given from the state superintendent at next Wednesday's public meeting. The Education Standards Committee, which is where the social studies work lives, is going to be meeting next week as well. And what I'm going to do is bring back to them all of your notes and ideas and questions, including this idea that like the feedback really can't just be a survey, that there's been a push from the SISAC to make this engagement really authentic, which would include focus groups, opportunities to meet with both teachers and with students in person. And also, I'll be honest, we have not talked about this at the Education Standards Committee in the way it was framed tonight, but I think it's essential that we do. That this also needs to be framed a little bit as a way to foil outside influence in commentating on our standards. So I want to bring that back to the Education Standards Committee, hear from them, and then regroup with all of you after the holidays, because that meeting is going to happen. We're all going to go on break, which is well-deserved. And I know better than to ask any educators to engage with me while you are breaking. Frankly, I don't want to be working on my break, so I can't imagine that you do. So I'll bring back the feedback I hear from them after the holidays. To be perfectly frank, we also have to bring this to OSSE, right? The written standards are owned by them. And so while the state board and OSSE are working in conjunction on this engagement, I need to make sure that we have this conversation with the state superintendent, as well as with her teaching and learning team, to make sure that we can align on how we do this work. So all of that'll take some time. Come back to you after the holidays. I am feeling so confident that pushing things back was the right call. I'm so glad that you all agree with that as the right call. I appreciate the additional questions you've illuminated tonight. For folks who were doing, so many things. Laura was at an LSAT meeting. Emily had a work thing. Karen had a MICVA thing. Everyone was very busy this evening, and I deeply appreciate the time you gave to me. But if there are thoughts that percolate later, as always, reach out, tell me, bring them up. We're also going to reach out to folks who weren't with us tonight and make sure that we get from them as well, so that that's all involved in this conversation. Last thing I'll say is we had basically put you guys on like an end point after December 2021. It sounds like there's still conversations to be had. So I imagine another thing we'd like to do after the holidays is reach back out to all of you and see if you want to continue to be part of these conversations. You have been so generous with your time that if the answer is no, that is okay. But if the answer is yes, we want to make sure we're only cluttering your inboxes because the answer is yes, and you want to continue to be part of these conversations in this way. So expect to get that outreach from us after the holidays to see to what level you want to continue to be involved. Any other thoughts, questions? You all are amazing. Thank you for your time. Happy holidays, happy rest, happy cake, because we heard from Molly's Margaret that cake is a very important topic tonight. So happy cake.
There has been 2 pieces of cake.
Two pieces of cake. Oh, amazing.
She ate her black beans and pizza. Yeah, 2 pieces of cake.
I love it. Well, I wish you all much cake. Happy holidays.
Happy holidays, everyone.